Hello and welcome to another episode of the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. My name is Phil Schiavone with the Coalition for Christian Outreach. And with me, I've got, of course, from Hearts and Minds Books in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, the host with the most to say about the books you should be reading, Byron Borger. How are you doing today?
Phil, I am great. I'm a little sore. I'm a little tired. I'm really mixed up in my business, but we just came off a Jubilee a week ago. And for those that aren't listening or don't know, most of our staff were there. But for those that may not know, it's that big conference in Pittsburgh that's the highlight of our liturgical year. and one of the great things we do all year long, selling books with the CCO's Jubilee Conference, which brings over 2,000 college students together to examine the lordship of Christ over all of life and what it means to be made in God's image and with dignity and respect, living in this fallen world and engaging the culture well. So it's a great, great event. My wife and I have been deeply, deeply involved in it since the 1970s, and it's our biggest book selling gig. So we've got boxes everywhere now that we've unloaded the truck and taken it back. But this was just last week, and we talked about the Jubilee Conference in our last episode, and you did a special drop-in extra episode of footage you even took at the book table talking to students about books. So why don't you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Byron. The previous episode was a special drop. It came out last week sometime, or maybe, last week sometime. And if you missed it by chance, go back and listen to it. It is, I wasn't sure how it would turn out, to be honest, Byron. I didn't know what students would say. I didn't know what speakers would say. I wasn't sure if it would come together and have a vibe that would make sense for a podcast episode. But while I was editing it, I was just smiling. I was just smiling at the faithful responses of students from not only all over the country, but I think we even got a little mix from all over the world in this episode. And then the staff and the speakers just did such an excellent job of living into their callings and saying the books that are inspiring them and why they were at Jubilee. You really need to listen to this, not just for the book recommendations on this one, but for me, it's an act of practicing hope. It's an act of practicing hope because we've got these 20-year-olds sparing a weekend of their college lives to explore theology and how it practices out in vocation and saying how it's changing their lives, saying the books that they're going to read going forward to continue to change their hearts and minds and make a difference in this world that just needs these shining lights in such dark times. We are living through it right now. And I'm so thankful. And I was just renewed in my own hope for Gen Z and for these 20-somethings that are taking their hearts and their minds and pointing them towards the gospel in world-transforming ways. You have to go back and listen to that episode. It's only about 20 minutes long, but gosh, it's so inspiring every single time I think about it. And I just have to implore you to listen to it if you haven't listened to it yet.
Phil, you couldn't have more nicely, absolutely right. It's why Beth and I work so hard to have such a big display out there, carrying books on every major we can think of, about 130 categories at least. A couple of the students are grad students. One was a psych mental health major working on her master's degree and pushing towards some certification. And she had a classic book that we happened to hire. And she's like, I've always wanted to read this. She was so glad she got it. And then other students were looking for just ordinary things to help them in their walk with Christ. A devotional by Bob Goff that they all got together. I thought that was so sweet. Three of them. And Bob had been to Jubilee a couple times in the past, giving vision and hope for a loving sort of response to the world. And so having people buy Bob Goff devotionals or books for their major, I mean, you can't go wrong and inspired by this new generation that wants to read deeply about real books. I just want to give a kudos and special applause out to a number of CCO staff that bring their students there. And some of them just drag along they hardly even know. And others are the leaders they've been mentoring and guiding in their campus ministry work. They bring these students there, but some of them raise extra money from donors like you and listeners like you. They give them extra money to buy a free book. And so a lot of the students line up with a coupon, and we've got the coupon. Some of them are funny and they have pictures of their campus on them or a fake dollar bill or something. Then the students have $20 off or a free book of their choice. That is really a blessing when a student gets blessed not only with the content of the conference and a workshop on their major or special interest, but also then they get a free book out of it oftentimes. So kudos to those CCO people that did that, and to those of you out there listening that have donated for these very purposes. Some even donate money to us at Hearts and Minds. Say, give a free book to somebody the next event you're going to. And so we just thank everybody for their generosity in making this thing work. And even this podcast that might inspire a couple of people interested in a book buying ministry, which is part and parcel of the Jubilee Conference. So thanks for everybody.
Yeah, we really do thank you, the listener, for tuning in and encouraging us to keep doing this work and supporting us financially in the various things that we do. It really does make a difference. And one of the things that I always have prepped college students for is we go to Jubilee, but then we do Jubilee, right? Like, it's not just about going to the conference and having a good time, but our life transitions from the mountaintop. And for many of the students, it's to spring break trips or back to, doing student fellowships and Bible studies and things like that. And for a lot of the rest of us, it's the liturgical calendar. It's Fat Tuesday and Ash Wednesday and leading us into Lent, which leads us into today's episode, Byron. So you've got 3-ish books for us here on Lent, I believe. Why don't you dive right into it?
I've got 3 books for Hearts and Minds for the season of Lent, and I'm going to squeeze a couple ones in passing. So if you don't count well, it's 3 books from Hearts and Minds, but there might be another allusion or two of a couple others. This liturgical calendar is just so significant for many of us. And for many of the students at Jubilee who aren't churched at all, or maybe are from independent and non-denominational churches that don't lean into the church calendar, it may be new material. Some of you CCO staff are listening, have to have conversations about this with your students, some who may be liturgically minded, some who may not be. But we sell books about Lent every year at Jubilee, which is always in February. And so it's that time of year. And it's interesting. We sold a handful of Lenten books that we had next to our daily devotional section at Jubilee. And these are some of the ones that actually sold. So I'd just like to tell you about them. Here's the first one. I probably said it last year. I've said it other places. I did an hour-long podcast with the Upper House, which is a Christian study center up at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And the Upper House folks have me on every couple of months to talk about books. And that's out there in podcast land too, with Susan Anderson interviewing me. But we started with this one. It is called Lent. Simple as that. The subtitle is The Season of Repentance and Renewal. And it's a series, we've talked about it often here, of little books that aren't really daily devotionals, although you can read them very devotionally, explaining the history and background and what you're supposed to get out of different eras of the church calendar. So there's one on Pentecost, there's one on Easter, of course, there's one on Christmas, there's one on Advent, obviously, Epiphany. So these are a series that are edited by Esau McCaulley. Esau is an African-American Bible scholar, teaches at Wheaton, got his PhD under N.T. Wright, and is an Anglican church planter as well. This is the first in the series, edited by Esau, and this one is written by Esau McCaulley, and it explains what the heck the season is about. He was raised in a Black Pentecostal church down south, never heard of Lent, certainly didn't follow it. If he heard about it, he thought it was Roman Catholic, and eventually, as a Protestant evangelical, finds his way to the Anglican tradition, where he is now a priest and a professor and as I say, a church planter. But this is the series he's put together, little short books that explain the history and background of the season. Lent is inescapably about repentance. So he starts off this church calendar series with a heavy one about what it means to turn your back on sin, to say no to the things of the world, to spend a season of silence and solitude and almsgiving, even fasting, where you give up and get in touch with your hungers and what you really want. It's a great overview of when Lent began, why it's 40 days, how that works, who does it, what you're supposed to get out of it. Great little book. I highly recommend it. And now I'm going to just parenthetically tell you about another one that doesn't really count here in the Lenten series, but it's just an advertisement because I have to say it. The new one, Easter, just came out by, again, a friend of the CCO who's been to Jubilee, Wes Hill. Wes Hill teaches at Hope College. Well, he teaches at Western Seminary, where Hope College is in Holland, Michigan, and he's a New Testament scholar, has written a number of books. This is his delightfully joyous, triumphant explanation of Eastertide, of the glory of Easter, the importance of Easter, and a season of Easter in the church calendar. We all say, he is risen, and everybody replies back, he is risen indeed. Where does that lingo even come from, and why is it important to celebrate a season of Eastertide? So this is going to be one that's coming up for you in this series. It's the second to last one in this church series called the Fullness of Time, edited by Esau, and one is by Hill. So just came out. It's new. It's exciting. It's not really Lenten, but I wanted to tell you about it anyway. So that's a little extra one I threw in there.
Yeah, that's great. I've read one of Esau McCaulley's books and a million of his articles at this point. And if you've never read Esau McCaulley, you just have to. He is poignant and he is direct and to the point, but yet in a way that's understandable. And one of those authors where like you can just sense your heart growing, your mind changing as you're reading. It's deep and well-meaning and like full of opportunity to grow in the knowledge that he's trying to teach you, and yet just impactful author, like someone that when you read it you're not going to think you've wasted your time at all. And so I would definitely be right there in recommending how he writes.
Phil, there's another guy that is not as well known, and he is on this same journey from a sort of fundamentalist background that did not attend to the church calendar or the liturgical seasons, and yet became Anglican, is now discovering sort of the sacramental worldview and the delightful sort of tone of living into this rhythm of the church year. His name is Aaron Damiani. And his first book is called The Good of Giving Up, Discovering the Freedom of Lent. Now, again, I mentioned that I'm only supposed to say 3. I'm putting this as a companion volume to this Lenten one because it is not a daily devotional for Lent. It is sort of the why and what for, how to do it, why you do it, and what you're supposed to get out of it. This is particularly about this topic that you hear often in popular culture of giving something up for Lent. He says, why do people do that? What's the point of that? Can it be sort of a temptation to be prideful of yourself, of giving things up, and isn't it sort of an empty ritual? You give up, something you maybe shouldn't have anyway, He says there is really something going on in this practice, and he unpacks it in a fresh way. He has some stuff you can do as an individual. He has sections about families. He even has a congregational section where communally you can do some of these things together. There's a little bit of purple ink in here. There's some little woodcuts in the beginning of the chapter that just give it sort of a kind of neat sort of look and a phrase or two that are, I don't know, it's just a special book to me. Like many evangelicals who really love the gospel, they've just had their doubts about Lent. And he invites us to the Lenten practice of giving things up and understanding why we sort of have fasting and the adventures of almsgiving and some of the standard stuff of prayer that you do, particularly during the Lenten season. So there's 2 kind of a double whammy, the Lenten one by Esau and the one by Aaron Damiani, both fresh to the topic, not cradle Episcopalians or Roman Catholics, but people who have discovered it anew. And so they're well equipped to tell us what the whole custom is about. And I wanted to start with those 2 as sort of my first one.
Yeah,
now, my
great.
second one I want to tell you about.
Yeah, go for it.
My second one is completely different, and it is a stunning piece of literature. Those that like memoirs and well-written, beautiful writing by a fairly controversial, if you will, a figure who I adore. Her name is Sara Miles. Sara wrote a book called The City of God. It's her 3rd book. Her first one was literally about how she was a foodie in San Francisco, a gay woman who has written a number of books about her own progressive worldview and standing for the poor, and also being a high-end foodie with some of the great restaurants. She's utterly unchurched. Walks by a very creative Episcopal church in San Francisco, notices they're doing something inside. She doesn't even exactly know what. She walks in and she takes communion. And for the first time in her life, tasting something like bread, which is her cup of tea, and immediately is converted to Jesus Christ. She's a progressive evangelical with justice mind, but she truly has a radical conversion experience by experiencing Christ in tasting the bread. Well, then she says, what's this about? I come to faith through food. Why don't we have a food pantry in the church? And she starts a food pantry, and the ritzy, cool Episcopal liturgists aren't so fond of all these poor people coming into their church. So she realizes right away the church ain't all it's cracked up to be, that a lot of people don't care about the poor the way they thought she thought they would, and aren't enjoying the blessings of sharing food as she thought they would. Well, that's her first book. It's called Taste and See. Her second one is called Jesus Freak, about how she continues to have this urban ministry. This third one, City of God, is a book set in one day, and it's Ash Wednesday. They meet, a group of ragtag Episcopalians in her church, and have a communion service and distribute the ashes. Marked with the ashes of Christ, they then go out into the city, pretty rough, multicultural, diversity, unemployed workers, undocumented workers, people in the streets, restaurants, all kind of folks, offering them ashes. Not coming to church for a service, not getting converted to Jesus, but just saying, this is a sacrament. You've seen, maybe you've heard about it. Let's do it. Would you like this? And inevitably, people either mock them and refuse, or more likely say, we'd love that. People that can't get to church, Roman Catholics who long for that but don't feel comfortable anymore, marginalized people, street people. She sees the church ministering in the inner city, particularly, offering the goodness of God's repentance, the call to repentance, the call to die. That's what ashes are about. Well, this ought not to be seen as good news to most people, but most people find it as very good news that the church wants to give them ashes, a sign of God's love, of their mortality, and of grace. So they spend the day doing this, and that's what the heart of the book is. Then at the very end, there's a final chapter where they come back, those that have done this throughout the day, and kind of debrief and have another closing nighttime service. So it's essentially a morning service, a day of ministry, distributing ashes to the unsuspecting, and then a debriefing at the end. It's one day in the life of Sara Miles. She calls it the City of God, ruminating a bit on Augustine's famous book about being in but not of the world, resident aliens of the world, as Augustine put it in City of God. And she sees the geography of the city, unchurched and secular as it may be, as an example. Means that there is grace involved, there's God's presence, there are sacramental ways to see even the poor of the inner city and to invite them into this ritual that stands for the beginning of Lent. I think this is probably dropping our podcast, Phil, on Ash Wednesday. But let me tell you this, it's never too late to ponder these great mysteries. And this is an urban ministry book. It's an evangelism book. It's an edgy, progressive Christian trying to do good work kind of story. But it is surrounded around the beginning of Lent and the experience of ashes, which some of us are into and some of us aren't. Some of us do and some of us don't. Whether you do or not, if you even want to understand kind of one way to understand what the sacrament of the ashes even are, I use the word sacrament loosely, what the ashes ritual is about, this is a great way into it. It's not a dry theological tomb, and it's not your typical Lenten read. This is a feisty, fun, creative woman doing extraordinary work in the City of God, and you're just left almost with your mouth agape at some of the stories she tells of the way people responded to this little ragtag group of people sharing ashes in the city of San Francisco. It's a great read, The City of God.
Yeah, great. I'm really encouraged by it. And I was reminded too that where you started with, the tasting of bread and the receiving of ashes on our forehead, that I'm still, after all these years of thinking through all of this, I'm still so prone to this disembodied faith that is just in my mind and in my beliefs. And this is such a great reminder of not only Ash Wednesday, but the Lenten practice of embodying what we believe by giving something up, or by engaging with the city, by having the ashes on our forehead, by I try and fast from something and commit to something else. And so trying to bring this kind of fullness of myself to the fore in one way or the other in my faith. And and for those of you watching the episode, right above me is a photo of me and our other co-host Sam Levy hanging out together at a Chuck E. Cheese of all places. But it's this encapsulation of our friendship where it's embodied. It's embodied in things like play and fun and baseball and reading and discussion. Where our friendship began in campus ministry when I was his campus minister, and he's gone on to join us in campus ministry. And Sam, as you've probably heard on this very podcast, loves thinking through this topic of how does food relate to our faith in a hands-on, tasting sort of way. He's brilliant on that topic, and so I kind of wish he was the one hosting this particular part of this episode. Which you're right, Byron.
Her first book about her conversion is really stunning on food and service to the poor and why people are hungry and what it means to eat well. In that book, it's interesting. One of the things that happens is that they have this kind of foodie, high-end chef, not quite like the bear on TV, but that kind of vibe, a high-end food celebration for the volunteers before they open the food pantry, of which people come in for this free meal, and they line up around the block. And then it dawns on them that this is really wrong to have this kind of feast for themselves and then give sort of standard, good, wholesome, nutritious food, but more traditional meal to the people at the soup kitchen. So they decide to do this sort of celebration for everybody. And so this food pantry and shopping experience and meal for the poor is really pretty high end. It's been written up in NPR and other journals and stuff because it's just so extraordinary how this foodie who comes to Christ through tasting ends up with a food ministry offering the poorest of the poor a great meal every week. Well, then she got into the ashes thing, and so this City of book is really, really something very well written, and I commend it. Well, my third book, the last one, the first one was the pair of books about the meaning of Lent. The second one was this story about somebody doing it. I think I ought to offer at least one book that really is reflections or sermons or like you could read devotionally. And it is one of my all-time favorite books. I have said on this podcast that one of my all-time favorite books is Fleming Rutledge's Advent book, looking for the second coming of Christ and the final restoration in the season of Advent, where we long for Christ's second coming. That's Advent. Well, one of her earlier books was a similar collection of sermons, and it also, like her Advent book, is one of my all-time favorites. It's called The Undoing of Death. I have a hardback edition of this. It's all dog-eared and Post-it notes on, and I read some of every Lent, and they're nothing but sermons that Fleming Rutledge, the great Episcopal preacher and theologian, has delivered over her lifetime of ministry. She's an older woman now in her retirement years, and this book just has years worth of Ash Wednesday services, Thursday night, Thursday sermons, Good Friday sermons, the pieces of the cross, the 7 last words of Christ, Holy Saturday services, which is not my tradition at all. What the heck happens when Jesus is dead and in the tomb, in the grave? Oftentimes in this book, she shows classic artwork, reproductions of bas relief paintings or medieval art or classic etchings. And so there's a lot of black and white reproductions that she used back in the day before even PowerPoint. Some of these were slides that she would show in her New York City lecture halls and sanctuaries, where she would give either lectures and or sermons. Most of these are real sermons, and they're often illustrated by the painting she's referring to. I've learned so much from this. I've been inspired so much for it. And it does not move into, they're all Holy Week sermons. It does end up with Easter Day. So there's a little bit on Easter and Easter week, what you do a couple days after Easter, what we call Easter Tide or the Great 50 Days. So there's even some good news sermons there. The heart of it is the undoing of death, Jesus literally defeating that final enemy, death itself, in its both personal sense and its cosmic sense. She really gets the broad scope of what Christ is doing as he defeats the gates of hell, and it's one of my all-time favorite books. So this is one you could certainly read during Lent, certainly during Holy Week, and then it'll last you a little bit even into Easter Tide. Fleming Rutledge, The Undoing of Death.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Byron. I took you up on her Advent book, and I didn't work the whole way through it, but good night can this saint just preach it? I mean, it's just, if you like good sermons, or you like good teachings, and that's kind of your ilk, like, she is just incredible at just bringing such a good word on the scriptures and their meaning and how they relate to the current day. Just great preaching. So
I've
any
heard her
final comments
already
on
with
your end?
more. Yeah, I've heard her already with more evangelical audiences, and she challenges them to read Karl Barth or old civil rights leaders. She was raised in the South and has affinity for some of the great civil rights leaders, white and black, of our past. And she pokes a little bit to stretch evangelicals to understand the breadth and scope of Christ. She'd be great at Jubilee. I've also heard her with liberal Episcopalians, and she challenges them to, like, despite their open-minded, creative, generative theology, to focus on the Bible and tell the Bible stories. She has a whole commentary on Romans. She has a whole commentary on preaching from the Old Testament. And she has several small volumes of other Good Friday sermons she's done, like the 7 Last Words services. They put together in little pocket editions that are not the ones in this book, but are even more. So there you go. She's the best.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much, Byron, for these excellent recommendations. A little more than 3, but I'll make sure that each and every book that you've mentioned makes the show notes, the description here in the episode, as well as our I'll put the links in to our friends at the Upper House that did that podcast episode with you too. That'll be in the link in the show description as well, so you can go check Byron and our friends up there. It's Wisconsin, right?
Yep, in Wisconsin. And don't forget Phil's 3 Books of Hearts and Minds special episode of interviewing the college students at Jubilee last week. That is a real delight to watch. And so find that as well and listen or watch that. It's a hoot. Yep, it's really fun, really creative. They say some funny stuff. Kelly Kapik, the great speaker, was there. Some of our CCO staff are there. That's a good one, Phil. And so I hope everybody tunes back and watches the special drop-in episode, even as they're listening to this one on Ash Wednesday.
Yeah, worthy enough that I'll probably just throw a link to it even in the show notes, even though you can probably just find it on your podcast app that you're listening to. But I'll throw that in there as well. Byron, thanks so much. There's just so much goodness wrapped up in this episode for us in exploring the Lenten season, and I am so excited for our listeners to get their hands on these books. And if that is you and you want to get your hands on these books, the very first link in the show notes will be a link to the order form, the Hearts and Minds books. Of course, we would encourage you to order those books through Hearts and Minds. And of course, we want you to read these books. And so if you have any comments or any feedback you want to give us, our email addresses will be in the show notes. And of course, you can respond by leaving comments and likes, and of course, subscribe and follow to the show. That'll help encourage others to tune in and others to read these books as well. And so we thank you, the listener, for once again tuning in to another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. And remember, until next time, read those books.